international law? Why is it interesting for legal anthropologists? And how does your work in international law intersect with your work at the Yale Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis?
Why is it interesting for anthropologists, right? That's the first question. Anthropologists and anthropology. Well, as we know, international law is relatively new on the scene as a formal institution, and it hasn't been a subject of anthropological scrutiny up until very recently. Part of the problem, and we talked about this earlier, part of the problem is that anthropologists in many ways went to faraway lands, remote places, in search of the, quote, primitive, right? Trying to understand the relationship between the evolution of mostly third world people and others more like them. So them being often European men that went out as part of a scientific study to study the other. There were different questions and a different focus and a different realm for trying to understand humankind and human progression. Today, there are tremendous changes compared to 100 years ago when Malinowski was engaged in ethnography. The most recent financial global crisis, the economic crisis, I think is an indicator of or says a lot about the extent to which economic linkages and state-by-state linkages have transformed our social world. So it's clear that this thing that we understand as globalization, the interconnectedness of economies, is relevant in our world, in our social world. So for anthropologists who are interested in studying people in their social world, in their environment, meanings of everyday actions, it's critical for anthropologists to also understand the multiple influences, be they based on everyday concerns in their own region or larger implications that have an effect on their governmental policy. And international law, human rights law, all of these things have an effect on state policy in many regards. And of course that has a significant effect on everyday people in particular regions. So to make a long story short, it's important to understand the multiple arenas of influence in people's social world. And for that reason, international law is relevant and critical for the anthropological lens. The goal of the center is to explore the multiple ways that things circulate in our world, right? So the idea isn't simply to study the economy or to study public policy and to assume that governmental policies have an impact on everyday people and that those people don't influence and have an impact on governmental policies. What we're interested in understanding is the interplay, the interrelationships, the linkages, and to understand the cultural implications for these transnational linkages. So it's clearly and directly related to my earlier response, because what we're trying to understand are the flows, right? The multi-directional influences of our social world, and we're interested in comparative approaches as well as relational approaches, not just in one region, but thinking about multiple regions and patterns and connections in multiple regions. At the center, we work on a range of projects with a number of collaborators, not just Yale-based collaborators, but also those who are elsewhere. We have a collaboration at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica at the Mona campus. We have a collaboration at the University of Toronto. We have a collaboration in Johannesburg at Wits University. We're also developing one in Hong Kong at the Hong Kong Institute. The idea is to think through the complexities of transnational circulations, and the fundamental goal is to rethink heavy-handed approaches that often presume that government policy simply impacts people who are situated in local spaces, but instead, as I've said, to look at the mutual relationship, following the concept globalization from below, the idea that there are multiple influences that are unidirectional.
Now, I want to ask you one question that's also based on the working title of Fiction of Justice, which is international law obviously has a political economic component to it, especially when we're talking about trade treaties or investment treaties or bids. I don't usually think of criminal law as having necessarily a political economic element to it, political economy element to it. When you were first doing this book, were you making connections between how these notions of justice are constructed at the International Criminal Court and how it might somehow be interrelated to global or transnational economic connections in sub-Saharan Africa?
When I started, I was interested in the political economic rise of international tribunal, in part because it wasn't seen. It's often not seen as a political economic. It's seen as a humanitarian morality and ethics and intervening because violence is wrong. What I wanted to do was to unravel the political economy, because what I found was that the rise of NGOs, the rise of these graduates to getting jobs, starting NGOs, working actively in these new arenas that are non-governmental arenas was part of the development of this new human rights economy that we saw unfold over the last 15 years. And I was interested in the link between humanitarianism, human rights, rule of law, and political economy. I wanted to understand who was traveling, who are the people who are writing treaties or negotiating terms or attending training sessions, who are the judges who are going to these trainings, where are they being educated, and who's funding this travel, who's funding the NGOs, and why are they being funded, particular NGOs and not others. What I found is that this is fundamentally enabled. The human rights, rule of law movements are fundamentally enabled by a political economy of human rights, or a political economy of the rule of law. This industry that was of interest to me. There's no way to understand the rise of treaty making without understanding this rule of law industry. And this is also, I guess, if I think about the earlier question you asked about why anthropologists should understand and study international law, it's also to understand social organization. How are these transformations taking place in our world? How are they being operationalized monetarily, economically? In what ways are states donating? How much are they donating? How is it being enabled? How are these agendas being enabled? And uncovering these processes allow us to uncover the fictions of what I call the fictions of justice. It is political economic, and I think that's the biggest surprise for many people. It is fundamentally connected to an economic engine around which democracy, transparency, particular kinds of freedoms are being enabled in our social world. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing, but it's important for us to be clear about the engines that are enabling certain kinds of transformations in our world. Not only is it linked up, but if we want to think about state actors, the question that we might ask in trying to understand how they are linked up is, why is it that 1/3 of the countries that had signed on to the Rome Statute are African countries? And in 2005, why was it that the majority of countries were African countries? What are the pressures that are being placed on African leaders to sign certain conventions and treaties that are absent in other states, like the U.S., like China, like India, Iraq, other states that are not signing? They're not signing. They're not under the jurisdiction of the ICC, but the ones that are often those that are dependent on IMF funding, World Bank funding. So there's a linkage mechanism that's at play that's part of this contemporary moment. And this linkage mechanism is what's forcing states to sign on to multiple treaties, not just the Rome Statute, but multiple treaties, and they're expressions of states' willingness to abide by democratic principles, transparency, the new rule of law mechanisms that are in place. These are instrumental. They're statements about compliance, and in order to get loans, many states have to also sign certain treaties as indicators of their willingness to comply. There's a political, economic machinery that is part of the cultural circulation and the kinds of movements that we're thinking about. Humanitarianism clearly is not simply about people who want to do good, but those who want to do good, their missions have to be subsidized and supported by larger institutions of power in order for those missions to be operationalized and put into play. And this is what, in the second half of the title of my book, this is what's critical, the challenge of legal pluralism. It's related to that. Legal pluralism has often been seen as a form of diversity, legal diversity, forms of difference, legal difference. And the second point of the book is to demonstrate that it's not really just about difference or pluralism. What we have to understand when we're thinking about different legal systems are the way that politics and power and economics are part of the manifestation of legal systems. We have to go well beyond, as anthropologists, as scholars of law, we have to go well beyond the legal pluralism argument and think through the relationship between legal difference and power, international, institutional, economic power.